Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a medical condition that can be triggered by something as simple as, say, leaning on your elbow or crossing your legs. It's a fascinating medical puzzle that actually took more than half a century to solve, and it all comes down to one tiny, missing piece of our genetic code. So, our story kicks off way back in 1947. A Dutch neurologist, a guy named De Jong, writes about this really strange case involving a young coal miner. The kid had been squatting at work for 2 weeks straight, and suddenly the nerves in his leg just gave out. He was left with weakness and numbness. It was a really bizarre reaction to what's a pretty common posture. This one single case turned out to be the very first clue in a mystery that would take decades to unravel. It was the first hint of a genetic condition that so often hides in plain sight, something easily mistaken for just being clumsy or a minor, everyday injury. Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with that minor's strange palsy. Then we'll really define what this condition is, uncover the genetics behind it, look at how doctors diagnose it, and finally, we'll explore what it's actually like to live with it. All right, let's start at the very beginning. We're going to trace the history here, starting with those first few observations that really suggested something very unusual was happening in certain families. The road from that first puzzling case to a definitive genetic answer was a long one. After De Young's report in 47, it took 17 years for the condition to even show up in English medical journals. But what's really wild is that it wasn't until 2012, think about that, a full 65 years later, that a descendant from one of De Young's original families was genetically tested, finally confirming the cause. So what is this thing? What is this condition that makes people's nerves so incredibly sensitive to pressure? Let's break it down. Okay, the official name is a mouthful: hereditary neuropathy with liability to pressure palsies, or HNPP for short. But the name actually tells you everything you need to know. It's hereditary, so it runs in families. It's a neuropathy, which means it affects your peripheral nerves. And the key feature is a liability to pressure palsies, which is just a fancy way of saying the nerves are super vulnerable to damage from even minor, everyday pressure. Now, you might look at these numbers and think, wow, that's incredibly rare. And while the official estimate is somewhere between 7 and 16 people per 100,000, a lot of experts believe HNPP is seriously underdiagnosed, because the symptoms can be temporary, right? So they often get brushed off, which means the real number of people with this could be a whole lot higher. So, how does this actually play out in daily life? Well, it's the simple stuff. Just crossing your legs for a bit too long can squish a nerve and lead to a temporary foot drop. Leaning on your elbow on a desk can make your whole hand go numb and weak. Even something like carrying heavy grocery bags can trigger an episode in your shoulder. These are the most common trouble spots. Okay, now we get to the core of the mystery. What is actually going on at a microscopic genetic level that causes this extreme vulnerability? Well, the answer is hiding out on chromosome 17 in a gene called PMP22. Now think of your nerve fibers like they're electrical wires. The myelin sheath is that plastic insulation that wraps around the wire to protect it. Well, PMP22 has the instructions for making a protein that's a key ingredient for keeping that insulation strong and healthy. And this is where it gets really, really cool. It all comes down to something called a gene dosage effect. It's not just about having the gene, it's about having the right amount. If you have an extra copy of the PMP22 gene, you get a totally different disorder called Charcot-Marie-Tooth type 1A. But with HNPP, the problem is a deletion. A copy of the gene is just gone. So the body can't make enough of that crucial protein, leaving the nerve's insulation thin, weak, and unstable. And this genetic deletion actually leaves behind physical evidence. You can see it under a microscope. The weakened myelin sheath develops these focal, kind of sausage-like swellings called tomacula. In fact, before genetic testing was a thing, finding these tomacula in a nerve biopsy was the only way to be sure someone had HNPP. So, given that the symptoms can come and go and look like a bunch of other problems, you can imagine that diagnosing HNPP can be a real challenge. So let's take a look at how doctors manage to separate it from other conditions that can look pretty similar. Doctors can really start to zero in on a diagnosis by comparing the clinical features. For instance, HNPP usually pops up between ages 20 and 40, and it's all about these recurring, localized, and often painless palsies. That's pretty different from its genetic cousin, CMT1A, which tends to start earlier in life and causes a more steady, progressive weakness. Nerve tests can also show specific patterns of slowing that are a dead giveaway for HNPP.
So the whole diagnostic journey kind of follows these steps. It all starts with the patient's story, these recurring pressure-induced episodes. Then, doctors will do some electrodiagnostic studies to confirm that, yep, the nerves are slowing down at those classic pressure points. And the final, nail-in-the-coffin step is a straightforward genetic test that looks for that PMP22 deletion. So getting a diagnosis, that's not the end of the story. For people with HNPP, it's really the beginning of learning how to navigate the world with a whole new awareness of their body's unique limits. And the first thing to know, and this is really important, is that the prognosis is generally good. Recovery from these acute episodes is the norm, even if it might take a few months sometimes. And most importantly, having HNPP does not shorten a person's life. Since there's no cure, management is all about prevention. And this is where patients can really take control. They learn to make these small but really significant lifestyle changes, avoiding postures like crossing their legs for a long time, using protective pads for their knees or elbows, just being mindful of repetitive movements. These simple actions can make a huge difference in how often they have these palsies. And there's one area where this knowledge is absolutely critically important. Patients have to let their doctors, and especially their surgeons, know about their HNPP diagnosis before any medical procedure. Why? Because being held in some weird or prolonged position during surgery can put their already vulnerable nerves at super high risk for severe, unexpected damage. The story of HNPP is just such a great reminder that behind really common complaints can be a specific, identifiable cause. What one person might brush off as just being clumsy or, sleeping on their arm funny could actually be a clue to their underlying genetic blueprint. It really makes you wonder, right? What else are we missing that's just hiding in plain sight?